absolute best time to deliver a science-based neuroscience lecture is immediately after lunch. I figure right now your insulin levels are spiking, your sugar levels are crashing, and I have about 7 minutes of consciousness left in this room. So in that time that we have together, I want to try to convince you of two things, and if I can convince you of these two things, then I've pretty much accomplished what I set out to do. Number one, that addiction, true addiction, is a neurological, progressive, relapsing brain disorder that belongs in the same category as Alzheimer's, multi-infarct dementia, Parkinson's. It is a disorder of the brain that has neurological, neurochemical, and morphological components. And number two, I will try to convince you that for people suffering from this neurological disorder, particularly addiction to opiates and opioids, medication-assisted treatment must be part and parcel of the treatment plan, or I promise you utter failure. So how many of you, just dating yourselves, how many of you remember these old ads, okay, right? This is your brain on drugs. Well, this was your brain on drugs in the 1970s and 1980s. This is now your brain on drugs today. We put you in a machine. Here you're looking at a PET scan. It is measuring metabolism of glucose in the brain. Whenever your brain is activated doing its work, it starts using up sugar to do its work, and we can see where that sugar is being metabolized, and so we know what your brain is doing, which part of your brain is activated. And we get a picture that looks something like this. And on the top row, you're looking at a human brain. You're looking at it from the bottom up as if it were cut midstream, and you're looking upward at it. And this person is in this machine and has been given cocaine. And you see these areas lighting up, yellow, orange, red areas. That is where the brain is doing its work, metabolizing glucose as it is doing its work. This is where cocaine is achieving its effects. The LC, the locus coeruleus, the raphe nucleus, the anterior pons. You don't need to memorize all the areas of the brain that are being lit up, but these are areas that affect motivation, memory, attention, regulation of affect. And on the bottom, you see somebody being given saline, basically salt water, and you see the brain remains unlit up. So it's not just reacting to anything, it is only reacting when it has been stimulated. So this tells us how the brain works, how it does what it does. All drugs of abuse do their work primarily by elevating dopamine. We love dopamine, okay? Dopamine releases something called endorphins. Endorphins are actually natural opiates that are in your brain. As we speak, you all have opiates in your brain right now. Why would you have opiates in your brain? Because your brain needs to reward you for doing things that keep you alive and keep the species propagated. It is a basic Darwinian survival of the fittest mechanism. We want to reward you for doing things that keep you alive. And so when you eat, your brain releases dopamine, and we like dopamine. Now, don't try this at home. What you are looking at here is a rat. We put electrodes into the rat's brain, and we then give the rat some very good tasting food, and we want to see how much dopamine is released when the rat eats food, because eating food is good from an evolutionary perspective. And as you can see there, circled now, the rat's levels of dopamine go from roughly about 50 to about 75 to 175. It's increasing basically 50 to 75% increase in dopamine. That rat is saying, oh, wow, that was really good. I should do that again. I should keep eating food because food makes me feel good, and that's how the rat continues to eat and survive. Now we take the same poor rat and we have an electrode in its brain while it is engaged in intromission. In other words, it is ejaculating during the course of sex. And we like to see how much dopamine is released when the rat does something that's good for keeping the species propagated, and it goes from 100 to 200, 100% increase. So we basically like sex about twice as much as we like food. from a neurological perspective. Can I get a testify? Thank you. Now, drugs of abuse work by hijacking this natural reward mechanism. They like to elevate dopamine even more. So we take this rat, and we now give the rat amphetamines, and it goes from 100 to 1,100, an over 10-fold increase. So we basically like amphetamines about 10 times as much as we like sex. Is it clear to you why people continue to take amphetamines once they start it, and why it can lead to an addictive disorder? We like cocaine. It goes from about 100, somewhere around 350. We like cocaine about 2 to 3 times more than we like sex. Nicotine, it turns out, goes from about 100 to almost 250. So we like nicotine about 50% more than we like food. It also turned out, however, that the rats particularly like nicotine immediately after sex. I can keep this up all day, okay? Now, morphine is an opiate that gives a lower mechanism of action. Instead of giving you this big dopamine spike, it gives you a gradual spike and keeps it going. That's why morphine is good for medicine as opposed to getting high on, because drugs that get you high, you take it, you get a huge spike, then it crashes, which keeps you chasing it. We like drugs that are much slower in their onset and mechanism of action and much lower. So morphine, although it does increase dopamine about the same level as sex, does it in a slower fashion and therefore works better as a medication. So this is the basic substrate of addiction medications. We take addictive medications, we take addictive drugs because they elevate the natural part of our brain that is meant to keep us doing something over and over again. Here's where the action is taking place. You are now looking at a nerve cell. You have billions of these nerve cells in your brains. You have the soma, that's the body, that's the nucleus of the nerve cell. That's where the mitochondria are. That's where it's metabolizing energy. That's where it keeps all the DNA. Then you have dendrites where it's receiving information, and you have the terminal axon. This is where the nerve cell receives information from its dendrite and then sends that information out along its axon to the terminal node. At that terminal node is where all the action takes place. You are now looking in that little space, you are looking at 2 nerve cells. The nerve cell on top has gone down its axon to the very end, and it's about to release a neurotransmitter at the end, and then the dendrite of the next nerve cell is below it, and there's a gap in between. So this is the way your nerve cells work. Electricity goes along the nerve cell, comes to a gap, it releases a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical. The neurotransmitter goes across that gap, stimulates the next nerve cell, and it lets off an electrical discharge. It's electricity, chemical, electricity, chemical, electricity, chemical. That's how your brains are working right now. They are doing that billions of times a second as we are speaking. You can see that this is a dopamine receptor. So you have all this dopamine in this pocket on the presynaptic nerve, and we want to get that dopamine across that space to the postsynaptic receptor. That will get us to release dopamine, release endorphins, and feel good. So how do we get that dopamine to cross that barrier? Well, the first thing we need to do is stimulate that nerve cell to release the dopamine. That's the sort of tan-colored molecules. That's your dopamine being released. It goes across the gap, and it sits on the blue receptor. Then you see those pink things? Those are called reuptake mechanisms. Once you're done with the dopamine, we're going to bring it back to the previous cell so we can use it again, okay? Bring it back, let it go, bring it back, let it go. That's what your brains are doing as we speak. So one thing we could do is we could put cocaine, those green molecules in there. Look what the cocaine's doing. It's going over to those reuptake mechanisms, and it's sitting there as if it were dopamine. You see how it bound to those purple-colored mechanisms? It's acting as if it's dopamine, blocking the reuptake, leaving more dopamine in that gap. Does everybody see it? It's stopping the garbage truck from picking up dopamine. As a result of the garbage truck not picking up dopamine, it's leaving more dopamine in there, and the dopamine is just continuously exciting and stimulating over and over and over again the next cell. That's how cocaine does what it does. It blocks reuptake of dopamine. You keep stimulating dopamine and saying, wow, good boy, good girl, that's fun, let's keep doing that, and it keeps the level of dopamine going. How do opioids work? Opioids work by masquerading as dopamine. They make believe they're dopamine, and they stimulate the dopamine receptors. So we can get more dopamine in there by being liars and masqueraders, or we can get dopamine in there by blocking the garbage trucks from picking it up. And that's how most of our drugs of abuse work. They're just making sure that more dopamine, more dopamine, more dopamine. Now, some drugs will also do this with serotonin. They'll do it with oxytocin. They'll do it with GABA. But these are other neurotransmitters in your brain. But that's how these drugs work. They are ensuring that there's more transmission of these neurochemicals in the brain, in a part of your brain that you really like. Okay? That's how they work. Now, we are not all equally predisposed to like these chemicals the most. The person on the top, you can see this is before the person takes methamphetamine. You see all that orange and yellow in the middle of the brain? That means this person has lots and lots and lots of dopamine receptors. They have lots of dopamine in their brain naturally. When you give that person methamphetamine, they already had a lot of it. Now they have too much, they don't really like it. How many of you have been given opiates for pain and you took it and you're like, how does anybody get addicted to this? I don't like this. That's because you already have a lot of opiate receptors in your brain, higher levels of dopamine, and so you're getting more than is comfortable. The person on the bottom had less receptors to begin with. They had less dopamine before they took the drug. Now they have a dopamine surge, and they now feel better than they ever had before. They really like it. So if you're the kind of person that doctor gives you Vicodin, and you take that Vicodin and say, oh my God, where have you been all my life? That means that you had lower levels of dopamine to begin with. You had a genetic vulnerability to liking dopamine and therefore continuing to take it. If you already had a lot of transmitters, you're probably less likely to take it. That's why we're not all equally predisposed to become addicted. Okay? How much is that predisposition? It's roughly a 50%. 50% of the contribution to addiction is due to these genetic, pre-existing neurological bases. Now, this is true for all drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, heroin, you name it. The more dopamine you have to begin with, the less you like it, and the less dopamine you had to begin with, the more you like it. The problem is it becomes a vicious cycle. Let's assume you had low levels of dopamine. I start giving you a medication that causes dopamine surges. Your brain naturally seeks homeostasis. It wants to go back to baseline. So if it has too much dopamine because of the drug you're taking, what does your brain do? It stops making its own dopamine. It makes less. It reduces its sensitivity to that dopamine. What do we call that? Tolerance. So you had low levels of dopamine. You were too low to begin with. Take the medication, you start feeling good, you start liking it, your brain stops making its own. If you stop taking the medication, now you already had too little dopamine to begin with. Now you have even less dopamine than you had before you started. Does everybody see how vicious the cycle can become? And the less you had to begin with, the faster that tolerance occurs. And so people who are predisposed are more likely to develop a compulsive need for that drug simply to feel normal. Not to feel good, to feel normal. Because what does too little dopamine feel like? Like life is just not interesting. My daughter just graduated high school. Yeah, I'm supposed to feel good about that, right? My son just got an A on his report card. I should feel good about that. I know what I'm supposed to feel, but I'm not elated because there's no dopamine surge. The rest of you, I see you guys laughing and joking and interacting. I don't even really know what that feels like. Now, do your clients say to you, you know, Doc, I think I'm feeling a little dopamine deprived at the moment? No, they say to you, you know, I just feel depressed. I feel bored. How many of you here? I just get bored. I don't know. I don't feel anything. I don't know what you mean. They're describing the best they can the phenomenology of depleted dopamine. How long does it take after the brain is interrupted? How long does it take for the brain to recover its functioning? At the top, you're looking at a normal brain. See all that yellow and orange? That's a well-functioning brain doing lots of work. Below that, you're looking at a cocaine abuser, 10 days of abstinence. Look how dark the brain is still after 10 days of not using. Look down at the bottom, a cocaine abuser, after 100 days, the brain is still dopamine deprived. So if you take somebody and say, I want you to go into a 28-day rehab, or a 30-day rehab, or a 90-day rehab, and you can't understand why this person isn't fixed, when they come back, you have no idea what you are talking about. You don't understand the disorder you're treating. You are basically making a bad situation worse by raising expectations beyond a brain that is functioning neurologically at an impaired, dysfunctional level. How long does it really take? Here you're looking at a methamphetamine abuser, but roughly the same thing. Somebody with a long history of methamphetamine addiction, you're out 14 months before that brain is resembling its baseline state, okay? So for people with long histories of opiate or methamphetamine or cocaine addictions, you're probably talking about a year before the brain is functioning at its pre-morbid state. And remember, many of the people who get addicted had low-level functioning to begin with. So getting back doesn't mean they're normal, it just means they're back to where they were, which was below what people who are comfortable neurologically would be experiencing. Everybody with me? Okay. Now, medications. What are we going to do about this? Well, there are several things that we can do. One thing we can do is we can give you an agonist medication. You guys remember from your English classes in high school, what was the agonist or the protagonist in the story? The protagonist is the hero. It's the person who's propelling all the action. So an agonist causes action. An agonist stimulates nerve cells the same way opiates does. In other words, it essentially is an opiate. And so what's an example of that? Methadone would be an example of giving somebody an opiate to treat opiate addiction. Now, why would we give somebody an opiate to treat opiate addiction? Because remember, heroin, for example, gives you a huge spike, 5-6 times the spike you get from Sax, and then boom, right back down again. And so, yeah, you're excited, depressed, and anhedonic. Excited, depressed, and anhedonic. Anhedonic means no pleasure. Excited, depressed, excited, depressed. So you keep chasing that medication, and you have to take it numerous times a day. An agonist medication gives you a much lower spike, and it stays at that lower level for a much longer period of time and then slowly goes down, so it keeps the person at an even level for a long period of time. If I gave you guys methadone, you would get high. At least I hope you would. If I gave methadone to somebody who was tolerant to methadone, they would have no euphoria, no high whatsoever, okay? It would simply be going to the nerve cells and stimulating the nerve cells preferentially. What does that mean? It means the methadone gets to the nerve cells before the heroin and wins the race. And even if the heroin gets there first, the methadone goes in and pushes the heroin off and says, I'm here, okay? Like duck, duck, goose. Methadone always wins the duck, duck, goose. And so it pushes the bad opiates out, and it keeps the nerve cells occupied with the more effective medication. Less addictive medication. What's another thing we could do? We could do an antagonist. An antagonist is the villain in the story. The antagonist stops action from occurring. An antagonist sits on the nerve cell and doesn't stimulate the nerve cell, but prevents the opiates from getting in. It says, I'm here, go away, and it just blocks the nerve cells so the opiates can't get in. What's an example of an antagonist? You might know it as naltrexone or Vivitrol, which is a long-acting version of naltrexone. It sits on the nerve cell and says, sorry, go sit at the other lunch table. This is for the cool kids. And the heroine has to go and find another place to go, and nobody will let the heroine sit there. And so if you have enough of the antagonist on board, you can't get high from an opiate, okay? Another thing we could do is give you a medication that makes you sick if you take a drug you're not supposed to take. So if I give you a disulfiram, you may know it as Antabuse, it doesn't do anything. But if you drink alcohol while you have disulfiram in your system, the two interact with each other and release a chemical that causes you to feel anxious, nervous, sweaty, having a flushing skin response. It triggers autonomic arousal that you don't like, and so you won't drink alcohol while the disulfiram is on board. We can also treat the underlying disorders. Remember I said people who are more likely to get addicted usually have low levels of serotonin, low levels of dopamine, low levels of neurochemicals. Some of that may be a symptom of a mental health disorder. For example, people who have low levels of catecholamines may be experiencing what? Depression, okay? So people who have low levels of certain chemicals, and so we can treat those chemicals to get them up so they're not relying on this addictive external chemical to feel normal, to feel what the rest of you feel, generally speaking. Those are our strategies, medication-wise. What are the three medications? I'm focusing on opiate dependence because we have most medications for this and because we're in the middle of an opioid crisis at the moment, and so I want to make sure you guys understand the treatment of opiate addiction in some respects as much or more than other drugs. We have methadone, which is a full agonist. We have naltrexone, which is a full antagonist. And we have buprenorphine, which is sort of mezza-mezza. It's a little of both. Partial agonist, partial blockade, okay? You might know Suboxone as what? I'm sorry, buprenorphine as what? I just gave you the answer, okay? You may know buprenorphine as Suboxone or Subutex. It gives a partial stimulation, but you're even less likely to get euphoric from it. You're less likely to develop the down-regulation. You're less likely to feel ill when the medication stops. So it blocks withdrawal, it blocks cravings, but it is less intoxicating even than methadone, less addictive even than methadone. These are the medications that we have available. Well, do they work? You're looking here at a review of studies I did. What percentage of people in the criminal justice system, mostly probation and parole, not a lot of pretrial services, I think, in these studies, but mostly probation and parole, but the neurological issues shouldn't change. We're looking at people on the left who just went to counseling without medications. And we look to see how many of people who go to counseling relapse to their opiate addiction within between 3 and 12 months. And you can see there that 27% in the first few months, up to 88% full-blown relapse in the criminal justice population. These are people who are being drug tested regularly and are going to go to jail very often with positive tests. So what do you think the success rate is outside the criminal justice system? It's negligible. To say it another way, treating somebody with non-medication assisted treatment for an opiate addiction is malpractice. Let me say that again. Treating somebody with an opiate addiction when the success rate is negligible, when the success rate is lower than the placebo rate, right? I mean, people get better just because they think they're going to get better. Put people in a drug-free counseling, they know they're not going to get better. You're not even getting a placebo effect. Is malpractice. It's contraindicated. You should not do it. Any treatment program you send people to who do not assess for medications, they don't have to provide it for themselves, but if they don't assess for when it might be indicated and refer or talk to their clients about it, if it's not part of their discussion, by definition, they are operating below the standard of care for the profession. You should not be working with them, period. They're no longer acceptable as a treatment program to receive your referrals. When you look at the people who receive medication in addition to counseling, you see studies of methadone, 24 to 66% relapse rates, about a 50% relapse rate, 53% for buprenorphine, and about an 8 to 38% relapse rates for individuals on naltrexone or Vivitrol. Now, do not get from this slide that naltrexone is better than methadone, because all of the comparisons have been the medication versus no medication. We've done very few studies figuring out which medication is better than the other. And the few studies that have been done have found no differences. However, we will discuss what good quality physicians would think of as probable reasons to give somebody one medication or the other. The point here is that if you're talking about reducing relapse rates substantially, not wiping them out, but reducing them substantially with the use of medications and having no success worth talking about when you are not using medications, okay? So, can you ignore all this evidence? What are the legal standards? We operate in a criminal justice system. Can you just say, I don't care about this, I say no? I said no, period. That's my answer. I'm a judge, I'm a probation officer, I'm a pretrial services officer, I can do whatever I want, okay? So the question is, can you? Well, there's a continuum from unbridled discretion. Because I said so, that's why you can't have it. Because I said so. I don't owe you an explanation. Or deliberate indifference, which means, well, I care about you. It's not that I don't care about you, this is just the conclusion I've reached, but I do care. Or I have a good reason for doing this, that it's related to a substantial state interest, it's reasonably related to your rehabilitation needs, it's likely to help, it's not likely to help. I have a rationale for it, and I can explain it to you. To strict scrutiny, what's the legal test, which means I have no other choice. It's not just a reasonable rationale for saying no. I have no choice but to say no, because anything else I do will be worse than giving you the medication. And finally, I have no discretion whatsoever. I have to give you the medication whether I want to or not. That's the continuum. Who does it apply to? Well, unbridled discretion is not going to apply in this room, but if you are dealing with people who are wards of the state, right? Kids in foster care or who are wards of the state, people involuntarily committed, people who are under guardianship, you can force these decisions on them. That's not really going to be happening for us unless you're dealing with some involuntarily committed cases. Deliberate indifference is the standard for prisoners, convicted jail inmates, and individuals released on parole when they're not entitled to parole. I've been released prematurely, but I could have been held in the facility through the end of my sentence. These people are governed by a deliberate indifference and standard unless I turn an intentional blind eye to your medical needs and the scientific evidence. It's what I say goes, okay? For probationers, it's a rational basis test. So a judge can impose, a probation officer can impose conditions of treatment and supervision as long as they are rationally related to the person's crime, likelihood of rehabilitation, and threat to public safety. There has to be a reasonable connection between that order and the person's crime, which means if you have a drug court, for example, or a judge who says, we have a policy that we do not allow medications for probationers in our department. We do not allow medications for people in our drug court. That is unconstitutional. Okay? Any drug court that has a ban is in violation of the rational basis test, because the rational basis test requires a rationale based on the needs of the person in front of you. If you have a policy that applies no matter who the probationer is, it can't be rationally related to that person's crime, that person's risk to public safety, that person's rehabilitation needs. So let me say it to you differently. Ain't nobody care about your policy, okay? You have no authority to say, I have a policy and my policy doesn't care about the Constitution. When it comes to your policy and the Constitution, you lose. Now, I understand that you're all working with drug courts right now that are doing this. I get that. But they are engaged in unconstitutional misconduct, abuse of judicial discretion. They have no such authority. For individuals who are pretrial, which is in your rubric, pretrial jail detainees, pretrial supervision, who have not been adjudicated guilty, who are presumed innocent, it is a strict scrutiny analysis. There has to be a compelling state interest and no reasonable alternative, or no less restrictive alternative. So when somebody's being held in pretrial in jail and being denied a medication they were on before they went in, that would not survive a constitutional analysis in most cases. Unlikely to survive. Then why are we doing this day in and day out all the time? Because nobody has ever tested this. We get away with it and have been getting away with it for decades, and so we are routinely engaged in unconstitutional misconduct. The problem is that we are now under attack. We meaning the criminal justice system. It should not have escaped your attention that we are the bad guys right now. Judges are mean-spirited SOBs, prosecutors are mean-spirited SOBs, probation officers and pretrial services officers, to the extent the public knows what you are and what you do, are mean-spirited SOBs. All you like to do is punish people, incarcerate people, use jail to treat addictive disorders, and the answer is not to teach you about evidence-based practices. That is not the goal of George Soros. He's not here to improve your education. What is he here to do? Remove you from the equation entirely, okay? You can't be trusted to follow the Constitution. You can't be trusted to engage in evidence-based practices. Therefore, you should have no authority. That's the goal. And there are test cases all over the country testing probation's right to impose sanctions for positive drug tests, challenging pretrial services, mostly judges, for denying medications to individuals on pretrial supervision. These cases are wending their way up through the federal courts. There is no doubt in my mind that they will lose and that the actions are unconstitutional. The problem is that when appellate courts decide what the remedy is, you won't like the remedy they fashion. The remedy will take away all of your authority. If we start cleaning our own house and develop our own standards of practice, they will hopefully enforce those standards rather than write their own from the bench. And so my job now is to write amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, to state Supreme Courts, begging them not to do something extreme, that there is a middle ground. Good luck with that, okay? Once there's a bad case with bad facts, it's very hard to get the courts to look for the middle ground. So we do not have the power to deny medications across the board for anybody, and especially on pretrial status, you better have no reasonable alternative. So if you say, well, this person's I think they're gonna sell the drug. We don't give it to them because they're gonna sell it. Well, then why don't you just do observed administration? Have the doc give them the medication and watch it. That's a less restrictive alternative. If it's a strict scrutiny analysis, your policy loses, because you could have done something else that would have achieved the same goal without a denial. That's the answer. That's the constitutional test. No discretion applies to, frankly now, to drug courts receiving federal funding. Because drug court judges decided people couldn't have medication for reasons that I'll never understand, the feds said, well, then you can't have federal funding anymore. And so now a drug court can't receive discretionary grant funding unless they attest in writing that they will not deny medication-assisted treatments to people as a condition of entry or require them to get off as a condition of graduation. So now the right has been taken away from judges to exercise any discretion in those cases. So if I have a doc who says Doug deserves methadone, and there are 47 other docs who say Doug's faking and he doesn't need methadone, as long as there's one doc who said I do, a judge has no discretion if he or she is receiving federal funding. I consider that to be probably unconstitutional itself as a violation of separation of powers, but that is the funding requirement at the moment. Why did they do something so extreme? Because they decided that you couldn't trust drug court judges to clean their own house, and so they were going to clean it for us. I don't think you guys want to be in the same boat, where they say you're not eligible for funding unless you do things that you may not think are the appropriate things to do, but that is the direction we're going in right now. The zeitgeist is not on our side. So now, let's assume that in a drug court, I have a doc who says, I think Doug needs methadone. And I have another doc who says, no, he doesn't need methadone. We could just give him naltrexone. Naltrexone is non-addictive. He can't overdose on it. He won't get high. I think naltrexone would be fine. Question: what authority does the judge or probation or pretrial services have to say yes to one medication but no to another, to choose one over the other? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what the legal test is, and nobody knows what the legal test is. So there are two legal tests that generally govern. The first is what's called the test of medically indicated treatment, or medical indication. Medical indication means the treatment is effective, it works, and it's accepted by the medical community that it works. So methadone has been proven effective for opiate addiction, and it's approved by the FDA. It's generally accepted by the field. Methadone is medically indicated. Even if somebody else says, what about naltrexone? It doesn't matter. If the standard is medical indication and a doctor said this person is indicated for methadone, that's the end of the analysis. It's not up to you to decide which medication you'd rather see them on, okay? The other test is the test of medical necessity, whether the treatment is medically necessary. So in addition to being proven effective and generally accepted, it has to have a better risk-benefit ratio than other alternatives. And it has to be at the right level and intensity. If it's a medical necessity analysis, then you could say, well, the doctor says that he should be on methadone, and methadone is medically indicated, but it's not necessary because naltrexone is also medically indicated and it has less risks. Therefore, we can go with naltrexone. Everybody with me? If it's medical indication, you don't get to choose. If it's medical necessity, you get to choose based on medical evidence from different physicians which medication to start with. We have no idea which standard applies. We don't know. We are telling our drug court judges, whatever standard you choose to apply, say on the record, this is the standard you're following, so that therefore an appellate court can review it and tell us what the test is. But you have to say how you reach the decision. So our recommendation to you would be, in your policies and procedures, based on medical evidence, you would use a standard of necessity or indication. Everybody with me? Now, if you don't have any docs to draw upon, and you're only relying on whatever doc in the field this person happens to be going to, then it's not going to matter because there's only going to be one doc involved. This only matters if you have other docs you can rely on to get their opinion as well. So my first recommendation to you is get other docs who you can rely on to their opinion as well, so you can get a balanced view of what an appropriate medication might look like. Otherwise, you're going to have to follow whatever the prescribing physician wants you to do. Everybody with me? Okay. Now, the statutes like the Americans with Disabilities Act, professional best practice standards can increase the level of scrutiny but cannot decrease it. You should know that the Legal Action Center, agreed to by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA, have concluded that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to people in the criminal justice system. And addiction is a recognized medical disorder. And so if somebody is in treatment for addiction, they are entitled to the same protections as anybody else under the ADA. And therefore, not only is it a constitutional analysis, but you are prohibited by the Americans with Disabilities Act to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their disorder to deny them a medication. If you wouldn't deny me a medication for diabetes, then you have the same exact requirement not to deny me a medication for addiction. That is the position of the Legal Action Center, and that is the position of the Bureau of Justice Assistance. If that's true, then the standard is not going to be medical indication, it's going to be medical necessity. Everybody with me? In other words, the goal here is to take away all of your discretion. That's the goal. You can't be trusted to think these issues through competently and intelligently and fairly. Therefore, it's not your decision. You will do what the docs say, or what the feds say, or what the ADA says, with no additional discretion to exercise. That's the direction that these advocates are pushing for. And so my recommendation to you is to develop your own standards of practice so that you have a well-defended, well-articulated set of procedures that you follow in these cases, so that they will then back your procedures rather than impose procedures on you. Now, I'm saying this to you, I'm saying this, I go all over the country, knowing full well that you probably won't do it. And as a result, they're going to impose these procedures on you. And the only reason I'm saying this is so I can come back and say I told you so, okay? That's why I'm doing it. So, somebody is receiving medication in your program, and you want to minimize misuse and diversion. There are many things you can do to reduce the likelihood people will misuse these medications. One thing you can do, the most effective of all, is observed administration. Watch them take the medication. Have a nurse, physician, clinical case manager, probation officer, pretrial officer, family member who's a trusted, pro-social, sober person, give them their medication each day. That is business as usual in methadone programs. You would never do self-administration until you were at least 90, probably 180 days into treatment. All medication is given that one dose and observed. That's the best way to reduce misuse. Adherence monitoring is I could have you do a drug test. If you're supposed to be taking buprenorphine, and I give you a drug test, and you don't test positive for buprenorphine, what could I might assume is going on? That you're not taking your medication. And why would you not be taking your medication? Maybe because you want to be able to take other opiates, and you don't want the buprenorphine to be blockading the medication. The problem is that many of these drugs you would have to do blood tests in order to look at buprenorphine levels, and so you're probably not going to do this unless you have really good reason to believe somebody is engaged in a course of misconduct. You're not going to be doing drug testing or extra urine testing every single week on everybody. It will be too expensive, but you might do it when you had reason to believe that somebody was up to something. Random callbacks, you have people come back unannounced, just like you have them come unannounced to do a drug test. Unannounced, they have to come and show you their pills. If they have too many pills, chances are they're not taking their medication at the right level. If they have too few pills, chances are they're taking too much, too frequently, or they may be diverting the medication. Now, of course, it's very easy for them to just even not take it and just take it out of the bottle, but too few pills is something they can't hide, and so you make sure that they have their pills on them. Another thing you could do is use a MEMS. You guys know what a medication event monitoring system is? This is a little cap you put on their pill bottle. And it has a microprocessor in it. Every time I open the pill bottle, it records the date, the time, and how many pills I took out of the bottle. So now you know how often they're taking their medication, when they're taking it, and how many pills they're taking out. Now again, you can't know for sure they actually took the pill, but at least you know they didn't take out 10 at once, and you know that they took their pills out when they were supposed to. Requiring people to get pre-approval before they get a new prescription for any medication that is addictive or intoxicating. Any medication that has an addictive property or is potentially intoxicating, you cannot go out and get a new prescription until you have received prior approval from the program, unless it's a medical emergency. Of course, if they're in a car accident and the doctor gives them something for pain on the scene, you're not going to hold them accountable for a true medical emergency, but they get pre-approval, and they must sign all releases of information necessary for the doc to communicate openly with you about their diagnosis, their prognosis, their course of treatment, okay? Failing to fill out a release of information is itself a violation of the conditions of community supervision, okay? So you don't have to worry about getting the medication is not necessarily the violation. It's the failure to do a release of information. It's a failure to disclose to the prescribing physician, oh, by the way, I am on pretrial supervision for a drug-related offense, and I have a treatment history of addiction. If they didn't tell the doc about that, that is the violation. The violation is not that they got a prescription. The violation is they didn't give the physician all the relevant information that a physician would need, okay? And that itself would be a violation of probation or the like. You guys know what PDMPs are? Prescription Drug Monitoring Programs. Every state except I think Minnesota, or I think maybe the one state that doesn't have it, but every other state has a PDMP where you can do a run on somebody's name, background, and find out every prescription they have received for a controlled substance in the last 12 months. So you can run these, and if your state doesn't allow you to do it, then you have the doc who's treating the client run a PDMP report to make sure they're not receiving prescriptions from other sources, okay, so that you know that they are only getting the approved prescriptions, okay? And then abuse deterrence formulations. You guys have noticed, or many of you may have noticed, that Suboxone that people take has buprenorphine in it. Then why do we have an "own" at the end of it? We have an "own" at the end of it because they put naloxone in with the buprenorphine. Naloxone is pretty much like naltrexone. Why would we mix naltrexone with buprenorphine? Well, the naltrexone is put in a way that's inert. It doesn't get released into the patient's body. But if the patient crushes it to inject it or snort it, it releases the naloxone. What happens when you release an antagonist into somebody who has opiates on board at the time? Anybody know what happens? It sweeps the opiates off the receptors, and the person goes to extreme acute withdrawal. The last thing in the world an opiate addict wants is withdrawal. Their whole life is about avoiding withdrawal. And so if they crush the medication as a way to get a higher dose, they will make themselves deathly ill. They might make that mistake once, they will not make it twice. And so this is a way to avoid abuse. Methadone is usually given in liquid form mixed with Tang or orange juice. Why would we give methadone in liquid form? So you can't tongue it, right? There's no way to save liquid in your mouth and then take it out, go outside and use it later. Naltrexone in the form of Vivitrol, doctor gives you a shot, you're blockaded for 30 days. I don't have to worry about you taking your medication every single day for 30 days, one shot, and I'll see you again in a month. So these are ways to avoid misuse. These are also less restrictive alternatives to saying no. And so if you're going to tell someone they can't have a medication, especially if they are on pretrial status, you need to consider all of these alternatives before you say, no, you can't have the medication. If any of these alternatives would help avoid the problems you're concerned about, then a denial is not the least restrictive alternative and would not survive a strict scrutiny analysis. If a court looks it over, they will say, no, well, you could have done this. You could have done a MEMS cap. You could have done callbacks. You could have done observed administration, and that would have fixed the problem. You don't get to say no just because it's easier. Is everybody with me? On the other hand, if you're in prison, you get to say no just because it's easier. Because that standard is deliberate indifference. It's just easier on me, on my institution, it's less costly, so we just say no across the board. For a prison inmate, that's okay. For a probationer, probably not okay. And for somebody on pretrial supervision, definitely not okay. Everybody got it? Okay, I realize there's a lot of ifs and thens here, so that's why I'm checking back with you. So, failure to abide by any of these conditions is a willful, what we call proximal infractions, and you can deliver a punitive response, not because you're not telling the person you can't have the medication. You're telling them that you can have the medication under these conditions, and if they violate these conditions, then it's this condition that you're delivering a consequence for. You're not delivering a consequence because they're taking medication, you're delivering a consequence because they're not following the rules of your program. But if these rules are not set out, And if they weren't communicated to people in advance, then imposing the sanctions might be perceived as unfair because you didn't have any standards in place and you didn't give people notice. So that's why these things need to be set up in advance before you start imposing consequences. Now, let's assume that you have two different docs and they're both arguing over the medication. I know that's a fantasy. You're lucky if you have one doc. But let's assume that you're actually learning about this and you're speaking to the docs in your community and you're starting to receive medical information, which is what we want you to do. And now you're trying to decide what would an intelligent physician do to decide what medication to choose. How would a smart doc decide between naltrexone, methadone, buprenorphine? Well, patient preference is a big issue. Most patients won't take a medication that they didn't want to take in the first place, and so in voluntary practice, this is basically the biggest issue. If the patient says, I want naltrexone and I want methadone, physicians will pretty much give them the medication they want because otherwise they'll just disappear. In the criminal justice system, we can be a little bit less giving in to patient preference exclusively because we have other leverage engaged, although perhaps on a pretrial basis, not necessarily as much. But on probation, we can say, what the patient wants is important, but it's not the only consideration. Past performance in treatment. If I have been on methadone in the past, and it worked really well for me, and I was functioning really well for 5 years, and then things fell apart and I'm now in front of you, if it worked well in the past, a smart physician is going to reinstitute a regime that worked before. In fact, it would be malpractice outside the criminal justice system for a physician not to institute a regimen that worked in the past without a very good reason. If it worked before, why aren't you using it? And the physician has to have a good reason. That's what an insurance company would want to know before they even agree to pay for a different treatment. So if they've been on treatment before and it worked, then that's something to consider. On the other hand, if they've been on a treatment before and it didn't work, it's malpractice for a physician to put you back on a regimen that we already know didn't work unless the physician has a good reason. Something has changed clinically that I think now something that didn't work before is more likely to work. So we tried naltrexone in the past, but he wouldn't take it. Now we want to try with the injectable so we don't have to worry about whether he'll take it. Or we tried naltrexone in the past and he didn't take it, but now because he's involved in the justice system and he's more motivated and his family is more energized, we think he'll be more likely to take it. But you have to have a good reason. A smart physician will always look at past performance in treatment, always. Age of onset. The younger you are, when you start disrupting your brain system, the less likely it is that your brain will get healed over 3, 6, 9, 12, 14 months. And in fact, if you start elevating dopamine when somebody is 11, 12, 13, 14 years of age, chances are their brain system will never return to what would have been its premorbid state, which is why kids who start using addictive drugs in early adolescence are more likely to become addicted. Their addiction tends to be more severe. They're less likely to respond to treatment, and they may need a much longer course of treatment. So somebody who's been using opiates when they're 14, less likely to respond to an antagonist because their dopamine levels are going to be much lower. They may need an agonist or a partial agonist. In addition, the longer you have been using drugs, the less likely your brain is to return to its previous level because it has been depleting dopamine. It has stopped making its own dopamine. For 6 months, maybe it'll be better, but if it hasn't been making dopamine for 15 years, the chances that once you stop taking the medication, it's going to go back to normal levels is much lower. So a physician wants to know, when did you start using and how long have you been using? And the earlier they started and the longer they've been using, the less likely they're going to respond to an antagonist, and the more likely a physician might say, I think we're going to need an agonist medication, like in this case, buprenorphine. Okay, everybody with me? Now, if you're dealing with juveniles, you've got two things working against each other. You're dealing with somebody who's 19 years old or 17 years old. Well, obviously, they started at a young age, but they probably have been using it for a much shorter period of time because they're much younger. That's a hard decision. It's a hard call whether we should consider the early onset to move us towards an agonist or whether we should consider the short period for an antagonist. We don't have any answers to that. That's something your physician will need to think through. Family history. If your mother was an alcoholic and your father died of an opiate overdose and your brother is in prison for his 15th arrest for possession with intent to distribute, if there's a long history of addiction in your family, are you more likely to have had a lot of neurotransmitters to begin with or low levels of neurotransmitter to begin with? Chances are you had a genetic predisposition, you probably had lower levels, and therefore, as a result of exposure to the drug, as a result of building tolerance, chances of you coming back to a normal level is lower. So if somebody has a strong family history, they're less likely to respond to a blockade, and we might want to think through perhaps using an agonist or a partial agonist. This is what a smart doc would be thinking in deciding what medication to choose. People with comorbid psychiatric disorders are more likely to respond to an agonist or a partial agonist than to an antagonist. So if somebody's got a bipolar disorder, major depression, schizophrenia in addition, chances are you're going to need a stronger disorder. I realize I'm just about out of time, so I just want to move quickly through the last things. Side effect profile. Naltrexone is non-addictive. It's not intoxicating. So if naltrexone is worth a shot, it's going to win on a necessity analysis. It's also, you're not going to die from an overdose of naltrexone. You can die from an overdose of methadone. And so if there's not good reason to move towards an agonist, then you want to give somebody an antagonist. Reduced tolerance. This is important. You put somebody on naltrexone. When you're on an antagonist, their tolerance goes down very quickly. If they go off the antagonist and they go back to using medication, if your tolerance has gone down, what happens when you start using? You are likely to overdose and maybe even die. And so if you think this person is not likely to stay on that naltrexone, and you think they're likely to go off it and disappear on you and relapse, then naltrexone might be a dangerous decision for a case like that. Naltrexone has no street value. Try to sell it. See what you get for it. Specialized training. Anybody with medical training can give you naltrexone. Anybody. Buprenorphine, they have to go through 8 hours of training in order to give it to you. Methadone, they have to be working in a specialized treatment unit. So that would lean towards using naltrexone because you don't need the same specialized training. And finally, tapering. You can take somebody off naltrexone almost immediately, but buprenorphine and methadone takes a long time to taper people off. How long? And I'll end on this. 18 to 24 months is the average length of time for a successful taper. 18 to 24 months. Some people will need longer, but if you're telling people they have to get off in 6 months or 3 months or 12 months, you don't know what you're talking about, okay? You're setting them up for a relapse if you taper them too quickly. So I want to thank you all for your attention. I realize I pushed a lot of material in a short period of time, but thank you very much.